Today we find ourselves at the National Archaeological Museum in San Salvador. Before us, we see an interpretation of the history of El Salvador, painted in 2011 by Antonio Bonilla, a Salvadoran artist who completed this work in only 4 months. The central panel has as its focus Archbishop, now Saint Oscar Romero. To our left, we see Pope St. John Paul II, who rejected Romero's plea for support of El Salvador's poor. He later assigned an Opus Dei bishop to San Salvador, who refused to continue Romero's advocacy for the poor. Behind and between them is Uncle Sam, who under Presidents Reagan and Bush 41 supported the government against the poor. To Romero's right is Roberto Dobison, a military officer, politician, and death squad leader who ordered Romero's assassination. To the extreme right, we see a red-tongued teller of lies. To the extreme left, a hideous woman, and to the center below Romero, a pudgy man holding his piggy bank, obviously the rich minority who oppress the poor majority. Next, we see the European colonizers of El Salvador, representing the military, the church, and business, nearly all of whom came to be the exploiters of the Salvadoran people. Next, we see the 6 Jesuits with their housekeeper and daughter, who were all assassinated at the University of Central America in 1989. The Jesuits were working for a negotiated settlement of the Civil War, and so were perceived by the military as subversives. And now, in the foreground, we see General Maximiliano Martinez and his associates, who assumed power in 1931, and who ordered the suppression of an uprising in western El Salvador in 1932, now called La Matanza, the massacre that killed between 10,000 and 40,000 people, mostly indigenous peasants and non-combatants. Then we see a well-off government man with his back to the common people, talking only to the rich. This disparity of class and culture began in the mid-16th century as part of Spanish colonization and the rise of cash crops of cocoa, indigo, and later coffee. This same disparity has continued throughout Salvadoran history with the advent of multinational corporations. Then we see General Arturo Molina, president of El Salvador, and behind him students being shot, following their protests at the University of El Salvador in 1971. Many such executions followed the 1932 uprising and continued into the Civil War of 1980 to 1992. Here in this panel, we see honored the many people whose family members and neighbors went missing in the 20th century as a result of government oppression. It is a mistake to reduce these uprisings simply to a struggle between Soviet-style communism and Western capitalist democracy. The foundational struggle, ongoing since colonization, has been between the small number of landowners and business people acting with governmental and military support against the peasant farmer class who provide the labor. Oscar Romero and some other priests were working from the inspiration of Vatican II and the subsequent Medellin documents from the Latin American bishops. The advent of secular leftists and then foreign powers made the reality quite complex, but the basic inequalities remain. The male and female figures in the olive green uniforms portray men and women who opposed the Salvadoran government from the 1960s until the truce of 1992. They represented a group called the FMLN, named after the leader of the 1932 peasant uprising that led to La Matanza, the massacre portrayed earlier. Also portrayed are enslaved native peoples who worked in the fields in cocoa, indigo, and coffee cultivation and production. African slaves were less prevalent here than in other Latin American countries. In this panel we see, and in earlier panels we saw, mythological figures, including the tiger or jaguar and the deer, familiar figures in Mayan mythology. Earlier, we saw the jaguar strangling the deer, representing in Salvadoran folklore the forces of oppression, such as Spain, the Salvadoran and United States governments attacking the traditions, culture, and beliefs of the people. Earlier, these forces were seen in conflict, at other times, as in this panel, acting in harmony, possibly portraying the Mayan defeat of colonial Spanish aggressors, the severed head, against the Mayan people. The severed head, the deer, and the jaguar might also represent the 1832 uprising, led by indigenous leader Anastasio Aquino, who was executed. The uprising protested the government's policy of land expropriation and taxation that unfairly affected the lands held by the indigenous population. This extraordinary mural covers centuries of Salvadoran history, in which the Western world and we are complicit. It's important for us to take this history on board, to realize its complexity, to realize the many forces at work, and pray that we can continue in the spirit of Oscar Romero, Rutilio Grande, the 6 Jesuits who were killed, their housekeeper and her daughter, that some mode of justice may come to this part of the world through our efforts, through the efforts of the Church, and the blessing of God, God's own self.